I'm Rick Brettell. I came to Dallas to be the director of the Dallas Museum. I'm now professor of aesthetic studies at the University of Texas, and I'm the founder of the Dallas Architecture Forum. So I care a lot about architecture and have since I was a kid. And in coming to Dallas, finding interesting architecture and sort of delving into the history of the architecture of the city was one of my first sort of avocations. And when you do that, you stumble very quickly on this guy named Howard Meyer. And in fact, the house I live in was a spec house done by Howard Meyer for these pair of brothers, I've forgotten the Lingo Brothers construction company. And it was the Natural Gas House of the Year in 1947. And so, though it's a spec house and though it was not one of his important buildings, it carries him in it. And so I've lived with him in a certain important sense for 22 years. Now, why is Howard Meyer important? I mean, Howard Meyer is the first internationally trained modernist architect who came to work in the north of Texas. He was not the first modernist architect, but he was the modernist architect who actually knew about modern architecture, had met Frank Lloyd Wright, had met Le Corbusier, had seen buildings by all the great modernists who'd worked in major architectural offices, who was in Lescaze's office in New York before coming to Dallas, and was somebody who, unlike anybody else in Dallas, was really internationally trained. He didn't have to read the architecture magazines. He didn't have to go on foreign trips in order to find out what the latest thing was. He knew it deeply. And of course, he arrived in Dallas during the Depression, and therefore a good many of his buildings in the 1930s were buildings that weren't cutting edge buildings because he had to make a living, and he designed a sort of thoroughly Virginia colonial house for a very wealthy man on White Rock Lake because it was a job, and he did a wonderful job of it. In fact, it's one of the best historicist houses in Dallas, but that's not why we know him. We know him because he internalized the three great 20th century modernist architects, Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, and Frank Lloyd Wright. And he created a kind of architecture in Dallas which really was the first serious modern architecture with an international bent. And the fact that he was deeply affected by Frank Lloyd Wright gave it an American dimension rather than a European international style dimension. He believed very much in regional and local materials. He wanted buildings that looked good where they were and that responded to climatic conditions, and that he didn't design machines for living, as Corbusier would have done or as Gropius would have done. Houses that could have been built in Brazil or France or Massachusetts or Texas. He built buildings of all types that were really designed to be contributions to modernist architecture on the one hand, but also deeply rooted in the place in which they were set. What's interesting about Howard Meyer's best buildings, and fortunately a good many of them survive, is this rare combination of being extremely exact and precise on the one hand, and being relaxed on the other hand. He was never really interested, like most modernist architects, in symmetry. And so his buildings kind of flow in certain ways and the spaces go one into the other. But that said, when you look at his bricks and his panels of wood and his grids and his flooring materials and his built-in furniture, there's a sense that you know they convey to you that nothing could be moved, that everything is where it ought to be and where it was designed to be. And that kind of odd combination of exactness and pre-planning on the one hand and relaxation and informality on the other hand is one of the things that I think is really unique to his sensibility. When you look back over Howard Meyer's career, and unfortunately I was such an idiot that even though I was in Dallas for the last 15 years of his life, I never met him. And so therefore I didn't have the pleasure, or if he was cantankerous, the displeasure of meeting him. So therefore my interest in him has no personal dimension. But when I think about the products of his imagination, the buildings that got built, and I think about 3525, and I think about the Temple Emmanuel, and I think about a handful of the best houses, there is nothing that can compare to them. I mean, anywhere. I have thought a lot about 3525 in the context of apartment houses, modernist apartment houses in the United States after the war. And of course, the ones that we know the best are Mises glass and brick and steel apartment houses in Chicago, which date from the late 40s and early 50s. And if you compare the Mies apartments in Chicago, which are canonical in the history of modern architecture, and if you compare their apartments, the way the spaces are controlled, the way that light is used in the buildings, the way that you use the buildings with 3525, built somewhat after the majority of them, it doesn't matter who you were, you would prefer to live in 3525 than in 810 or 860 Lakeshore Drive, because Howard Meyer actually put into the apartment building as much of the house and of living on the ground and being comfortable and not being seared by the sun and not freezing in the winter, and having a kind of plan which really allowed for both public and private use and was generous without being overly, sort of grand. And, to think of other modernist apartment buildings in America built anywhere. When this building was opened in 1957, I mean, it wins the competition hands down. And if you go to LA, or if you go to Houston, or you go to Atlanta, and other cities in the southern tier that also built tall buildings at the same period of time, or compare it to the other buildings built in Dallas at the same period of time, also by well-known architects, it is head and shoulders above them. And it actually deserves to be really famous. And I would say the same thing about the synagogue. There's something about Temple Emmanuel that, I will never forget first going to it. It was the building that made me aware of Howard Meyer as an architect, because I wanted immediately to know who designed it. And, I go there for other people's bar mitzvahs and weddings and funerals and whatever. So I'm not a regular goer to the synagogue. But the first time I went into that great space, I thought, this is one of the noblest, most subtle, most beautifully expressed spaces I'd ever been in. And learning about the collaborations that he had with Georgi Kepesh and Annie Albers and the William Worcester and the Bergers and the other people who were involved in this kind of team approach to design, the fact that he could synthesize all of that talent and all of those very strong-minded and very talented people, and to get them all to work together to create something so coherent, means that he also had an extraordinary capability to lead and to be a team worker. And that's something which is actually rare in modern architecture, and something which I think comes out in Howard Meyer's buildings, this kind of odd combination of strength and quietness. And I think he must have been like that, because that's the way the buildings come off. And, I've been in many, many synagogues by many famous architects all across the country, because a good many of the most important modernist architects were commissioned by various Jewish communities to design synagogues in the post-war period, when the automobile took people out of the inner cities and out into the suburbs. And Elk Park by Frank Lloyd Wright is just zany and amazing and fantastic and over the top, but once you've seen it, and it's a little bit too strong, and it's not really for recurring use. And, if Louis Kahn had done his great synagogue in Philadelphia, which was never built, it might have rivaled Temple Emmanuel as the best public space, Jewish public space, built in America in the 1950s. And, even I've been to strange ones in El Paso, Texas, and in Los Angeles, and the synagogue where my friends were all bar mitzvah